Chapter 1. Morgue Candle. London, 1887. The fog on the streets of London was not just a natural phenomenon, but an entity, a living, breathing organism, devouring and consuming the city. It easily penetrated the lungs with the acrid smoke of thousands of fireplaces, absorbing the smells of rotting garbage, sewage, and human misery. On such nights, the gas jets on the streets fought the fog like lone knights against a dragon, casting pale, blurry circles of light within which shadows swarmed. Dr. Alabaster Crowe wasn't afraid of the fog. He was afraid of what lurked beyond it. And what lurked beyond it, he knew, was something far more monstrous than the thieves or the Whitechapel maniacs. His carriage, black and ponderous like a hearse, rumbled over the cobblestones of the East End. The wheels churned up mud mixed with who knows what, and the driver, wrapped in a damp cloak, shouted occasionally at the horses, whose nervous snorts were the only living sounds in this stony, foggy suffocation. Crowe leaned back against the leather seat, closing his eyes. The weariness was as deep as an old coal mine. He worked as a pathologist at St. Bartholomew's Hospital, one of the best in the city. His hands, long and slender, like a pianist's fingers, had already dissected over 100 bodies, unraveling the tangled web of causes that led to a person's final breath. But in the last 3 months, everything had changed. At first, these cases were isolated. Vagrants whose bodies were found in the slums. Death was attributed to hunger, cold, typhus. But Crowe saw something else. Muscle tone unusual for a corpse. Bite marks, not dog or rat, human. And most importantly, a strange, cloudy fluid in the eyeballs that wouldn't coagulate and smelled of copper and something rotten. Sweetish, like spoiled honey. Then the cases became more frequent. Bodies started disappearing from the morgues. First one, then 2 more. The thief was never found. And then, a week ago, an entire family was brought in from the outskirts. A father, mother, and 2 children, all dead, with similar symptoms. And that same night, the orderly on duty, an old drunk named Billy, swore he saw the youngest child, a boy of about 7, sit on the table and try to bite his arm. Billy flogged the boy and locked him in a closet, deciding he was merely dying, not dead. By morning, the boy was truly dead, and Billy had developed a fever. Crowe was called to see him 2 days later. Billy was lying in the isolation ward, shaking, his skin the color of ash. He was delirious, muttering something about moving dead and a curse from the swamps. And most importantly, his eyes. Those same cloudy, milky eyes. The doctor ordered that no one be allowed near, but it was too late. Billy had died the night before, and that evening, a terrified young intern burst into Crowe's office with the news that the orderly's body had disappeared. It was then that a note, delivered by an errand boy, landed on Crowe's desk. It was short, written in a trembling hand. "Doctor, he's back. He's at my house. Help. Alice." Alice Turner, the nurse. The same one who helped him with his family, and Billy, Smart, cool-headed, not the type to be scared. If she writes he and help, things are bad. The carriage stopped abruptly, making Crowe wince. He glanced out the window. They were on Gosper Street, a narrow street where the houses, peeling and crooked, almost met, leaving only a dirty strip for the sky. The air was thick and heavy, smelling of mold and stagnant water. "Wait here," he said to the coachman, getting out and wrapping his dark coat around himself. "No matter how long I'm there." The coachman, without saying a word, merely nodded, his face hidden in shadow and fog. Crowe picked up his doctor's bag. Not just any bag, but a specially equipped one. Besides scalpels and clamps, it contained sturdy leather straps, morphine ampules, and a large, heavy wooden mallet he'd once brought from Austria for performing craniotomy. Now, it was his main argument against something that shouldn't exist. The door to Alice's house was ajar. The darkness inside was thick, like a mouth ready to swallow anyone who entered. Crowe pushed the door and it creaked open. Inside, it smelled of disinfectant, lavender soap, the scent Alice always carried, and something else, that sweet smell of rotting honey. "Alice?" he called softly, stepping into the tiny hallway. No one answered. A single lamp, shaded, burned dimly in the living room, casting flickering shadows on the cheap wallpaper. Everything was clean and tidy. The only thing that immediately caught my eye was an overturned chair and untouched iced tea on the table. Crowe's heart began to beat faster. He placed his suitcase on the table and slowly moved further down the hallway leading to the bedroom. "Alice, it's me, Crowe." The silence was ringing, absolute. He listened. Not a sound, not a breath, not a footstep. And then he caught another sound. Quiet, wet, squelching. It was coming from behind the bedroom door. Crowe gripped the handle of the hammer he'd managed to pull out of his bag. His palms were sweaty. He walked to the door and slowly opened it. The room was plunged into darkness, only the dim light from the living room revealing individual details. A figure sat on the bed. Alice. She sat with her back to the door, her shoulders tense and trembling. Her hair, usually neatly combed, disheveled. "Alice?" Crowe called again, taking a step inside. The slurping sound stopped. The figure on the bed froze. I couldn't handle it, doctor," came her voice, but it wasn't hers. It was hoarse, raspy, as if her throat was filled with sand. "He came. I couldn't stop him." "Who came, Alice? Billy?" She turned her head slowly, with an unnatural, mechanical creaking sound. The light from the living room fell on her face. Crowe suppressed a groan. Her face was as pale as a sheet, her skin taut as a drum. But the most terrifying thing was her eyes. They were completely covered in that same milky white haze, through which her pupils shone like black, dead spots. Dark, almost black blood trickled from the corner of her mouth, and on her hands, on her white coat, were brown, sticky stains. "He was hungry," she croaked. "And I was too." She turned her whole body toward him. She held a dark mass in her hands. Crowe looked closer and realized with horror that it was the remains of a rat, which she had apparently just eaten. Contagious, Alice, Crowe said quietly, taking a step back and raising the hammer. It's a disease. I can help you. Help? She made a sound like laughter. No one can help. This isn't a disease, doctor. This is death. A new death. And it wants to eat. She rose from the bed. Her movements were not smooth but abrupt, jerky, as if she were a puppet being manipulated by an inept puppeteer. Alice stretched out her arms, her fingers clenching and unclenching. You smell like life, doctor. So fresh. Crowe retreated into the living room, his mind racing. He didn't want to do this. Alice was a good person. But what stood before him was no longer Alice. She followed him, her body moving with a terrifying, inhuman determination. She stumbled on the threshold but didn't fall. She merely swayed, righted herself, and began crawling toward him again. I don't want to hurt you, Alice, he shouted, bumping into the table. Pain? She let out that horrible laugh again. I don't feel pain. I only feel hunger. She lunged forward, her hands gripping the hem of his coat. The force was incredible. Crowe, not a small or weak man, felt himself being thrown backward. He hit the wall with his back, a groan escaping his chest. Alice's fingers dug into his forearm and he felt claws, no, nails, but sharp as claws, pierce fabric and skin. He swung the hammer. I'm sorry. The blow landed on her temple. There was a dull, bone-like crunch. Her head jerked back, but she didn't let go. No blood gushed from the wound on her temple. Only that same dark, thick liquid oozed. Her cloudy eyes didn't even blink. She simply pulled him toward her mouth, which had already opened, revealing clenched, bloody teeth. Crowe lunged desperately, tearing the buttons off his coat, and jumped back. She lost her balance and fell onto the table, knocking over the lamp. The glass shattered, kerosene spilled, and for a moment, the room was plunged into near-total darkness, the only thing left being the faint glow of the wick on the floor, casting wild, dancing shadows. In the dim light, Crowe saw her silhouette. She was rising, slowly, inexorably. A flap of skin hung from her temple, exposing bone, but it didn't seem to bother her at all. Panic, cold and sharp as a razor blade, pierced him. His mind screamed that it was impossible, but his body acted on its own. He lunged for his suitcase on the floor. Alice, or rather what she had become, moved toward him, stumbling over furniture but not slowing her pace. His fingers found the leather handle of the suitcase. He unfastened the clasps, felt for the morphine ampule and the syringe, but it was useless. She didn't need morphine. She didn't need anesthesia. Her shadow fell upon him. He raised his head. She was already above him, her face distorted not by rage but by emptiness. Absolute, all-consuming emptiness, behind which lurked only one instinct. Crowe rolled to the side and her fingers dug into the floor where his head had been a second ago. He jumped to his feet, no longer holding a hammer, but a heavy lead paper press that had been sitting on the dresser. It was smaller than the hammer, but heavier. In your Lord, Alice, I trust. He whispered an old, almost forgotten prayer and hit her on the head with all his might. There was a deafening, wet sound. Her head snapped back at an unnatural angle. She froze for a moment. Then her legs gave way, and she collapsed to the floor like a sack of bones. Crowe stood over her, breathing heavily. There was a lump in his throat. The hand she was clutching burned. He looked at her. Black fluid was oozing from 2 wounds on her head, but she was no longer moving. He waited a minute, then another. Silence. Only his own ragged breathing and the crackling of the smoldering fuse on the floor. Alabaster approached and leaned over, trying not to look into her clouded, unseeing eyes. He checked her pulse. Nothing. There was no breathing. But he already knew that wasn't an indicator. So Crowe took a long surgical probe from his bag and, shuddering with disgust, slowly inserted it into her ear canal, aiming the tip at the base of her skull, destroying the cerebellum. An old barbaric procedure to confirm death before beginning an autopsy. Now, it was the only reliable way. Only after that did he straighten up. Everything was done. Alabaster looked at his bloody sleeve, at the devastation in the room, at the body of the woman who had been his colleague just hours ago. The horror receded, replaced by a chilling, all-consuming clarity. This wasn't madness. This wasn't a hallucination. This was a plague. A new one, unseen. A plague that turned the dead into walking predators. And it was here, in London. It was already among them. He walked to the window and pulled back the curtain. The fog still swirled behind the glass, obscuring the streets, the houses, the thousands of sleeping people, unaware of the death already knocking at their doors. Morgue candle, he whispered to himself. An old pathological term for a corpse that had already become infected. London. Great, smoky, vicious, and magnificent, has become a gigantic morgue. Chapter 2. The Night Guest and the Morning News. Alabaster Crowe acted quickly, with the practiced, emotionless precision honed by years in anatomy class. Thoughts of morality, of sin, of what he had just committed, or rather been forced to commit, were pushed to the darkest corner of his mind. Now he needed to focus on survival, and also to understand the full scale of the disaster. The first thing he did was examine his hand. The punctures from Alice's nails were shallow, but the edges of the wounds were already inflamed, turning a purple-blue tint. They burned, as if from a poisonous insect bite. Crowe pulled a vial of carbolic acid from his bag, wet a handkerchief, and, gritting his teeth, wiped the wounds. The pain was sharp and piercing, but he knew it was nothing compared to what was to come. Then he turned to the body. The thought of leaving it here was monstrous. Someone might find it. Panic might set in. Or worse, the body might rise again. He didn't yet know the limits of this curse. Crowe glanced around the room. The carpet on the floor was old and threadbare. That was the solution. Wrapping Alice's body in the carpet, he heaved it over his shoulder with difficulty, using techniques known to every undertaker. It was surprisingly light, dehydrated. As he carried his grisly burden out of the house, he paused for a moment in the doorway, listening. The street was empty. The fog, his old ally, hid everything. The coachman, seeing him with the carpet-wrapped cargo, didn't utter a word. He simply jumped down from the box and silently helped shove the bundle into the back of the carriage. These men, working nights in the very depths of London, knew that the fewer questions, the longer you live. To Baker Street, Crowe said quietly, climbing inside. But not to my house. Stop at the pavement, I'll walk out. He couldn't risk anyone seeing the carriage at his door at such an hour and with such a load. The walk to St. Bartholomew's Hospital felt like an eternity. Every rustle outside the window, every cry of a nightbird made him shudder. He looked at the bundle on the seat opposite him and felt cold sweat trickle down his back. He, Dr. Alabaster Crowe, a man of science, had just murdered a woman and stolen her body. His mind refused to accept this reality. The hospital was quiet. The night shift dozed in their cubicles. He used the back entrance, which led directly to the basement where the morgue was located. The metal door creaked open, admitting him into a realm of formalin and death. He unfolded Alice's body on the same marble table where she had so often assisted him during autopsies. In the bright light of the gas jets, he could examine everything in greater detail. Rigor mortis had set in with unusual speed, but the muscles retained a strange, snake-like flexibility. Her body temperature had barely dropped, and there was that smell. That same sweet, putrid smell that would haunt him for the rest of his days. He took the scalpel. He needed to understand, to know the enemy. Crowe worked until dawn. He opened the chest cavity and examined the organs. The heart was shriveled and blackened, as if it had been scorched from the inside. The liver and spleen were far more decomposed than expected for someone recently deceased. But the brain was alive. No, not in the sense of consciousness, but in the sense of biological activity. It pulsed, emitting that same black liquid that Crowe surmised was the carrier of the infection. Some kind of neurotoxic substance that restructured the entire life support system, killing the personality but leaving behind basic motor functions and a monstrous, all-consuming hunger. He took samples: blood, lymph, tissue fragments. He carefully arranged everything in sterile flasks and test tubes. Then, with a heavy heart, he began the most horrific part. Crowe decapitated the body, severed the joints, and severed the limbs. He couldn't allow this body, already disfigured by science, to rise again. The remains were packed in sacks of quicklime and hidden in the farthest corner of the utility room, behind old jars of anatomical specimens. When Alabaster finally finished and rose from the basement, the first rays of morning sun were already filtering through the hospital's smoke-blackened windows. He felt like an old man. Every muscle ached, and the wound on his arm throbbed with a dull, ominous pain. But only one thought lingered in his mind. This is only the beginning. Locked in his office, Crowe leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. He couldn't sleep. Images appeared before him. Alice's cloudy eyes, bloody teeth, the sound of slurping. There was a knock on the door. Sharply, insistently. Crowe shuddered, his heart skipping a beat. "They've already come for me," flashed a panicked thought. "Come in," he said, trying to keep his voice from shaking. The door opened, and a man in a long Scotland Yard coat entered the office. Short and stocky, with intelligent, piercing eyes that seemed to see everything at once. Inspector Edgar Abercrombie. They knew each other. Crowe had often consulted with the police on complex cases. "Crowe," the inspector nodded, removing his bowler hat. His face was serious. "Am I disturbing you?" "Not at all, Inspector." Crowe gestured for him to sit. "To what do I owe thee, sir?" Abercrombie sat down, resting his bowler hat on his knees. He paused, studying the doctor's face. "You look terrible, Alabaster. Haven't you slept?" "Work," Crowe answered shortly. "Everyone has a job," the inspector sighed. "But not everyone has bodies disappearing at night and then finding mutilated bodies in the slums." Crowe felt a chill run down his spine. "What's happened?" "Last night, Thames Dock. The night watchman, old Jack, was found dead. Or rather, he was found, but—" Abercrombie winced. "He was found gnawed. Bite marks, Crowe, human ones, and there were bare footprints all around. But not the ones that ran away, the ones that wandered in circles, as if someone was feasting and in no hurry." Crowe was silent, feeling a lump rise in his throat. "And this morning," the inspector continued, lowering his voice, "in Whitechapel, a woman was found in an alley, or rather, what was left of her. And next to her sat her husband, the same one who died of consumption 3 days ago. He sat and chewed on her hand." "Was he alive?" Crowe asked quietly. "No!" Abercrombie slammed his palm on the armrest. "Hell no, he was dead, cold and blue, but he was sitting up and moving. When the constables tried to subdue him, he bit one of them in the face. They had to shoot him, a bullet to the head. Only then did he calm down." A heavy silence fell over the office. The inspector looked at Crowe, searching his eyes for, if not an answer, then at least understanding. "Alabaster, I'm not superstitious. But what's happening? People whisper about demons, about curses. They say it's Jack the Ripper's revenge, that he's not human. I don't know what to think. You're a pathologist. You've seen everything. Tell me, what is this plague?" Crowe rose slowly and walked to the window. The city was waking up. Smoke from chimneys, the rumble of carriages, the cries of peddlers. A typical London day. And in his basement lay the dismembered remains of one of the plague's victims. And in the slums there were probably dozens, if not more. "Edgar," he said, turning to the inspector. His voice was firm, as it hadn't been for some time. "What you saw, those weren't demons. It was a disease." "What disease makes the dead devour the living?" Abercrombie chuckled skeptically. "I don't know, but I intend to find out. And you must help me." "How?" Information. Crowe walked up to the table and picked up one of the test tubes of black liquid. All the cases. All the missing bodies. All the attacks. The damned, as they're apparently called now. Put it all together. And find me the first one. The very first missing body, or the first attack. The source. Without it, we'll all die. Abercrombie looked at him with undisguised amazement. You talk as if it were the plague. That's right, Inspector, Crowe said coldly. Worse than bubonic, and it's already here. The inspector thought for a moment, twirling his bowler hat in his hands. Finally, he nodded. Okay, I'll look at the reports. But Crowe, if it really is the plague, then quarantine won't help us. How can we quarantine those who are already dead? After Abercrombie left, Crowe was alone again. He walked over to the map of London hanging on the wall. He pricked a pin at the spot in the East End where the first family had been found. He stuck another pin at a dock on the Thames, a third at Whitechapel. It wasn't a pattern but chaos. But he felt like somewhere there had to be a 0 point, the place where it all began. His arm was burning. He rolled up his sleeve and saw with horror that dark, crimson veins from the wounds had crept up toward his elbow. Poison. Or infection. It was inside him. He walked over to the chemical cabinet, poured a glass of whiskey, not the best antiseptic, but the only one he had on hand, and downed it in one gulp. A flame raced down his throat, momentarily distracting him from the pain. He looked at his instruments, the test tubes, the map. The enemy was invisible, terrifying, and infinitely dangerous. But he, Dr. Alabaster Crowe, had taken the Hippocratic Oath to fight the disease to the end, even if that disease was death itself. And outside the window, in the thick morning fog, a new sound was emerging for London. Not a scream or a groan, but a low, drawn-out roar, resembling both a human voice and an animal roar. The hunters were waking up. Chapter 3. The First Bite and the Mystery of the Sea Ghost. The pain in his arm became his constant companion. It wasn't just physical. It was a living, pulsing shadow beneath his skin, a reminder that the hours of his sanity might soon be numbered. Crimson veins, like the roots of poison ivy, now crept almost to his shoulder. He hid them beneath thick cuffs and a frock coat, but every movement echoed with a dull, deep ache. In his office, under the bright light of a lamp, Crowe set up a makeshift laboratory. Test tubes containing Alice's blood samples and the black, oily substance from her brain stood in a rack next to a microscope, an expensive new device he'd purchased in Germany. What he saw through the eyepiece defied any known laws of biology. The blood cells, the red blood cells, were deformed, glued together into strange branched structures, surrounded by aggressive, mobile spores of a black substance. It wasn't a bacterium. It was something else. A parasite? A fungus? Or some previously unknown life form that fed on death itself? He made notes in his diary, his handwriting, usually calligraphic, now nervous and ragged. October 24th. The substance necrus, tentative name, exhibits properties of both a prion infection and a parasitic organism. It affects the central nervous system, overriding basic instincts. Feeding behavior is distorted. a craving for flesh likely to obtain the nutrients necessary to support the abnormal metabolism. There is no pain threshold. Consciousness is lost. Only the motor complex and hunger remain. The connecting thread is a fluid secreted by the brain. It is possible that it is transmitted through this, and also presumably through a bite and probably by airborne droplets at or near the moment of death. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing the bridge of his nose. Airborne. That explained it to Billy. He hadn't been bitten, he'd just been near a dying boy. So, anyone near someone dying of this plague was at risk, and apparently everyone was infected. The infection rate was 100%. There was another knock on the door. This time it was soft, almost timid. Mrs. Harson, his housekeeper, entered, carrying a tray with a steaming teapot and a fresh bun. "Doctor, you haven't left your office all day. You need something to eat," she said, placing the tray on the edge of the paper-strewn desk. Her commanding tone was filled with a shrewd, loving concern. Her gaze fell on his arm. He instinctively pulled down his sleeve. "Are you injured, sir?" "It's nothing, Mrs. Harson. I cut myself on a broken flask," he lied, turning back to the microscope. "Thank you very much for the tea." She stood for a moment longer, feeling the tension in the air, then nodded and left, quietly closing the door. Crowe couldn't risk it. If she noticed his strange state, questions would start. He couldn't trust anyone. No one, except perhaps Abercrombie. As if answering his thoughts, the familiar clatter of hooves and the creaking of wheels could be heard outside the window. A minute later, the inspector entered the office without ceremony. His face was as gloomy as the London sky before a thunderstorm. "Well, Crowe, I've been digging through the reports," he began, throwing his coat on the coat rack. "You were right, it's the plague, and it's spreading like a stain from spilled port." He spread out his police map of London, covered with red crosses, on the table. The first official case of a Londoner's unusual disappearance occurred 2.5 weeks ago. The morgue at St. Elizabeth's Parish Church in the East End. An old man had vanished, dead of dropsy. No one paid any attention. They chalked it up to body snatchers for dissecting rooms. Then another, and another, all within a mile of the docks. "Docks," Crowe drawled. "Inspector, that guard, Jack, was he hired or did he work for a specific company?" "For the company. East India Trading Company. He was guarding a warehouse on the embankment where they were unloading the last ship, which had arrived 2 weeks ago." Sea Ghost. The ship's name hung in the air like an omen. "Sea Ghost?" Crowe asked. "An old ship," Abercrombie nodded. "She sailed to India and back. She arrived with her holds full. Tea, silk, spices. But the captain, a certain Arthur McBride, was listed as ill according to the documents. He came down with a fever just before reaching the English Channel. He was taken to the hospital, where he died 3 days later. From the same fever as the first family you dissected." Crowe jumped up. "The ship's captain is patient 0. Where is his body? Where is the captain's body?" "That's the rub," Abercrombie chuckled grimly. "It's gone. From St. Mary's Hospital, where it was taken, the night after his death. The guard on duty at the morgue is missing too." Crowe grabbed the map. It all fit. The ship, the captain who brought the infection, the docks, the East End, the epicenter. "We need to get on that ship, Edgar, now." "That's impossible." The inspector shook his head. "The Sea Ghost is under quarantine. The order comes directly from the ministry." They say there are rats and plague there. No one is allowed near it." "The plague," Crowe whispered with bitter irony. "Oh yes, it's the plague, but not the one they're thinking about. We have to get there." Suddenly, Mrs. Harson's frightened scream came from the hallway, followed by a dull thud and the sound of breaking glass. Crowe and Abercrombie exchanged glances and rushed to the door. The hallway was in chaos. A tray of tea lay scattered on the floor, the teapot scattered in shards. Mrs. Harson, pale as a sheet, pressed herself against the wall, pointing with a trembling hand toward the front door. He was here," she breathed. Looking out the window, his eyes. Oh my God, his eyes. "Who?" Abercrombie asked sharply, instinctively reaching for his baton. "The boy. The same one. The market peddler, Tommy. But he couldn't look at me. He's dead. I saw his funeral procession the other day. He died of scarlet fever." Crowe rushed to the door and flung it open. The street was deserted. Only the evening fog clung to the pavement, but on the dirty window pane, a greasy, cloudy imprint remained, as if someone had pressed their face against it. And just below that, a thin, dark streak, as if from dripping saliva. Crowe's heart sank. They were already here. They were hunting. And they knew where he lived. "She's right," Crowe said quietly, slamming the door and turning to Abercrombie. "They're walking in daylight, or at least in the twilight. They're learning." The inspector, usually unflappable, looked shocked. Seeing fear on such a man's face was more terrifying than any monster. "What are we going to do, Alabaster?" he asked, his voice uncertain for the first time. "We're going to the Sea Ghost," Crowe declared firmly. "Quarantine or not. If we don't find an answer there, within a week London will be a graveyard for the walking dead. And you, Mrs. Harson," he turned to the terrified housekeeper, "pack the most essential things and get as far away from London as possible. You can't stay here." While Mrs. Harson, quietly whispering prayers, prepared herself, Crowe took Abercrombie aside. "Edgar, there's one more thing. My hand." He rolled up his sleeve. The inspector gasped as he saw the crimson web of infection. "Damn it, Crowe, are you infected?" "Yes. Alice. That night. I don't have much time. I don't know how much is left. But while I'm in my right mind, I have to act." Abercrombie looked at him silently, and a whole storm of emotions could be seen in his eyes. Horror, pity, despair, and stern determination. "Then we'll get it," he nodded briefly. "I'll get us a pass to the docks. Meet me at the West India Docks gate in 2 hours. And Alabaster." He placed a hand on his shoulder. "If at any point you feel like you're no longer yourself—" "I'll handle it myself," Crowe interrupted quietly. "I promise." An hour later, having sent Mrs. Harson to what he considered the relative safety of a distant relative's boarding house, Crowe stood on the Thames embankment. The wind carried the scents of salt, tar, and rotting seaweed, but through them he distinctly detected that same Swedish tang. It emanated from the enormous, dark hull of a three-masted bark bobbing in the distance. The Sea Ghost. Not a soul was visible on its deck. 2 Royal Marines with rifles stood at the gangway, but they looked more like jailers keeping anyone in than guards keeping something out. Abercrombie rode up to them, accompanied by 2 of his most trusted constables. "It's all settled," he said, stepping out of the carriage. "The official line is we're investigating smuggling. 5 minutes. They definitely won't give us more." They passed the guards, who reluctantly let them pass. The wooden gangway creaked and sagged under their feet. The air around the ship was heavy, dead. Not even the seagulls circled above. Stepping onto the deck, Crowe felt a chill of dread wash over him. The deck was in perfect order. The rigging had been stowed. Everything was clean. Too clean for a ship that had supposedly had its sick captain removed and then quarantined. There was no sign of panic, no abandoned belongings. There was only deathly silence, broken only by the creaking of the masts and the splash of water against the side. "I don't understand anything," whispered one of the constables. "There's no one here." "Don't jump to conclusions," Crowe said, approaching the hatch leading to the hold. "They could be down there." He opened the hatch slightly. That familiar scent hit his nose, thick, almost tangible. The darkness in the hold was absolute. Abercrombie lit the lantern and pointed the beam downward. The light revealed piles of bales and boxes from the darkness. Everything was neatly stacked. Too neat. "Hey!" the inspector shouted. "Is anyone here?" A soft, rustling sound came from the depths of the hold. It sounded like something heavy and wet was being dragged across the wooden floor. Crowe descended the ramp first, clutching a lantern in one hand and his surgical hammer in the other. Abercrombie and the constables followed, barely concealing their nervous tremors. The hold was vast, like a cathedral dedicated to the dark god of commerce. The air was stale, saturated with the smells of tea, spices, and decay. And then the beam of the flashlight picked them out. They stood in the back, leaning against bales or simply frozen in the middle of the aisle. 10 people, at least, sailors. Their clothes were fine, but their faces were sallow, their eyes clouded over. They didn't move, they simply stood there, staring into space. Like dolls arranged on shelves. "God Almighty," whispered one of the constables, his hand trembling as he aimed the barrel of his revolver at the motionless figures. "Don't shoot," Crowe ordered sharply. "Don't provoke them until they move." They moved slowly, deeper. The dead didn't react. They looked like statues on display in a nightmare museum. And suddenly, Crowe noticed something. In the center of the hold, in a cleared area, lay a single, split-open bale. Protruding from it were neither silk nor tea, but strange, twisted, almost black branches of some kind of plant. They were covered in buds that resembled shriveled, wrinkled heads. Crowe moved closer. The smell was coming from there. It was the strongest. He leaned in to examine it. And at that moment the silence of the hold was pierced by icy, insane laughter. A figure in a tattered captain's uniform rose from behind the bale. His face was haggard, his eyes blazing with a feverish glint, but they were clear. He wasn't one of them. He was alive. "Finally!" he shouted, his voice echoing throughout the hold. "Guests, have you come to see my children? My beautiful harvest?" "Captain McBride?" Abercrombie asked cautiously. "Are you alive?" "Alive?" The captain laughed again, and there was genuine hysteria in his laughter. "Oh yes, I'm alive. Unlike them. They died almost immediately. They died beautifully. And then they woke up. And my greenhouse bloomed." He pointed at the strange plant. "What is it?" Crowe shouted, fear and hope warring within him. This man knew. "This?" The captain stroked the wrinkled bud tenderly. "It's salvation. Or a curse. Depends on how you look at it. We found it on a tiny island, uncharted, where the fog never clears. The locals whispered, afraid to approach. They called it the flower of silence. They said it only grows on bones. We took it on board, for science, you understand? For glory." He coughed and blood appeared on his lips. "But it must flourish. On dead flesh. First the animals in the hold. Then the sailors began to get sick. To die. And then to wake up. And bring him new food. He gave them life. New life. And they serve him." Crowe stared at the plant in horror. It wasn't a virus, not a bacteria. It was symbiosis. A parasitic plant that infected the dead, turning them into its gardeners, providing it with nourishment. And the black substance, was that its pollen? Juice? "How can this be stopped?" Crowe demanded, taking a step forward. "Stop it!" The captain looked at him with madness and strange pity. "You can't stop the blooming. You can only burn the garden, the whole garden. But it's too late." He gestured at the motionless sailors. "They've already woken up." And at that very moment, all the dead in the hold, as if on command, turned their heads. Their cloudy eyes stared at the living people in the center of the hall. Their mouths slowly opened. The hunters went out hunting. Chapter 4. Escape from the hold and fiery purification. The silence exploded. A low, drawn-out groan, erupting from a dozen throats simultaneously, shattered it. It wasn't the cry of the living. It was the roar of hungry swamps, the grinding of underground stones, the sound of death itself finding its voice. The previously motionless figures of the sailors shuddered and stepped forward in unison. Their movements, initially abrupt and choppy, quickly acquired an eerie, fluid coordination, as if they were all puppets controlled by a single will, the will of that very flower. "Back! To the gangway!" Abercrombie shouted, drawing his revolver. One of the constables, a young man with shaking hands, couldn't bear it any longer. He fired. The bullet struck the nearest dead man in the chest. He merely staggered, black liquid spurting from the wound, but he didn't stop. His hands, strong and accustomed to the ropes, reached out to the constable. "The head! Shoot him in the head!" Crowe roared, retreating and raising his hammer. Abercrombie, a cool-headed soldier, took aim and fired. The sailor's head jerked back, and a chunk of skull and brain flew out, stained black. The dead man collapsed to the floor, completely frozen. but there were too many of them. They walked, ignoring the gunfire, closing in a semicircle. Their cloudy eyes were fixed on living flesh, their mouths open in a silent roar. Captain McBride knelt beside his brainchild, hugging the bundle with the flower of silence, and laughed and cried at the same time. See how beautiful they are? They are the future. Crowe fought back with a hammer. A blow to the arm of one of the attackers cracked the bone, but the sailor merely changed trajectory, trying to grab him with his other hand. Their strength was monstrous. The smell was suffocating. "Get to the gangway, damn it!" Abercrombie shouted again, firing at point-blank range at another dead man. They retreated, firing back. One of the constables, the one who had fired first, tripped over a crate. A moment later, 2 men were upon him. His scream was short and deafeningly loud in the confined space, and then it was drowned out by the same slurping, flesh-tearing sound Crowe had heard in Alice's house. Blood spattered the faces of his comrades. The second constable, seeing this, rushed toward the gangway with a face contorted with horror. But 3 more blocked his path. Crowe realized it was a trap. They had been lured into the thick of it. "Fire!" he shouted at Abercrombie. "We must set the ship on fire. It's the only way." "Are you crazy? We'll burn alive here," the inspector responded, fending off the tenacious fingers with the butt of his revolver. "We have no choice. These are seeds, spores. If they spread—" Suddenly, the beam of his flashlight plucked a barrel standing to the side from the darkness. It had a familiar skull and crossbones painted on it, along with the word resin. "Resin!" Crowe lunged at her, pushing aside another corpse. He slammed the hammer down on the barrel. The wood cracked, and a thick, black mass gushed onto the floor. "Abercrombie, the lantern!" The inspector, realizing his plan, threw his lantern into a pool of tar. The glass shattered, and the kerosene from the burner instantly ignited. The flames hissed and roared as they raced through the tar, reaching the barrel, which exploded with a dull roar, spraying flaming droplets throughout the hold. The flames were fierce and hungry. They licked the wooden beams and spread to the bales of silken tea. Smoke, thick, black, acrid, rose toward the ceiling, filling the space. The dead seemed momentarily at a loss. Fire was the only thing they seemed to fear. Some retreated, their dried skin and oil-soaked clothing flaring like gunpowder. "Run!" Crowe shouted, coughing. They rushed toward the gangway, pushing their way through the blazing bodies. Abercrombie fired, Crowe hammered. The air grew hot. The smoke stung their eyes. They were almost to the gangway when Captain McBride suddenly appeared from the clouds of smoke before them. He held a huge, blossoming bud of the flower of silence. It was black and velvety, and from its core oozed that familiar liquid. "You don't understand," the captain screamed, his madness reaching its peak. "This is immortality. I gave them immortality." He threw the flower at Crowe. He instinctively batted it away with his hammer. The bud shattered, sending a cloud of black pollen into the air. Crowe managed to hold his breath, but a few grains settled on his face and lips. He tasted copper and rot. Abercrombie, without hesitation, shot the captain in the chest. He flew back into the raging flames, his dying laughter mingling with the crackling of the fire. They rushed onto the deck, coughing, their clothes smoldering. The two constables remained in the hold forever. "Off the bridge," Abercrombie gasped for breath, at once, and set the gangway on fire. The Marines, seeing the blazing hold and two charred, bloodied men, rushed to obey the order. They dropped the ladder into the water and hurled several incendiary charges into the open hatch. The fire on the ship flared up again. Crowe and Abercrombie stumbled along the dock, getting as far away from the burning ship as they could. Behind them, a column of black smoke rose, and orange flames burst from the portholes. Inhuman screams echoed from the sea ghost, the cries of the dead burning alive. They stopped, kneeling, and witnessed a terrifying sight. Several burning figures, engulfed in flames like torches, leaped from the deck into the Thames. Hissing and smoking, they disappeared beneath the dark water. "Damn," Abercrombie breathed, wiping his face with soot and blood. "They're in the river. They floated away." Crowe stared at the water in horror. He remembered the scattered bud and the black pollen. He remembered the burning corpses that had leaped into the water. Fire could destroy the ship, but it couldn't cleanse the river. He turned and looked at the burning sea ghost. Flames were devouring the masts, illuminating the gathering dusk with a hellish glow. It was a Pyrrhic victory. They had found the source, but they couldn't contain it. The plague wasn't just on land anymore. It was in the water. Abercrombie laid a heavy hand on his shoulder. "You're right, Crowe. This is war, and it's only just begun." Crowe didn't answer. He stared at his reflection in the dark water by the docks. His face was covered in soot, and his eyes were filled with unrelenting pain. Then his gaze fell on his arm. The crimson veins seemed to pulse in time with the glow of the fire. They had already reached his collarbone. He felt a slight, barely perceptible taste of sweetness on his tongue, and a sudden, distorted feeling of hunger. Chapter 5. Fever and shadows of Whitechapel. Returning to his house on Baker Street, Crowe felt more than just ill. He felt his body becoming a battlefield. The fever had set in even in the carriage. Waves of heat followed by icy chills. But this wasn't ordinary malaria. It felt like thousands of insects were crawling under his skin, like molten lead had frozen in his bones. And that hunger, that same alien, twisted hunger that arose at the sight of a gaping passerby, or even his own hand. He locked himself in his office, sending Mrs. Harson a note that he was ill and best not to be disturbed. He couldn't risk it. Not now. On the table in front of him lay his instruments, test tubes of Necrus, and his diary. His hand, trembling, wrote on the page. October 26th. Contact with flower spores confirms the hypothesis of multiple routes of infection. The incubation period after direct ingestion of a healthy organism is 48 to 72 hours. Symptoms: fever, muscle spasms, heightened sense of smell, especially for bodily fluids, and loss of appetite. Mental changes: increasing apathy, followed by outbursts of unmotivated aggression. Consciousness is still intact, but he didn't finish it. But he felt it. He felt something dark and faceless rising from the depths of his subconscious, trying to eclipse his mind, his personality. It was like trying to keep a heavy, sodden weight afloat in a raging sea. With each passing hour, the weight grew heavier. He took a small, elegant Webley revolver from the safe. He checked the cylinder. All 6 cartridges were there. He placed it on the edge of the table, next to the inkwell. The final argument. The promise he made to Abercrombie. A knock on the door made him jump. The inspector's voice was tense but recognizable. "Crowe, it's me. Open up for heaven's sake." Crowe, overcoming his weakness, rose and pulled back the bolt. Abercrombie stumbled into the office. He looked even more exhausted than he had after the ship. His clothes were covered in dirt, and there was a fresh scratch on his arm. "They're everywhere, Alabaster," he began, oblivious to his friend's condition, lighting a cigar with trembling fingers. After the fire at the docks, it was like a dam burst. Cases started popping up all over the East End. Not just a few, but dozens. There's carnage in Whitechapel. People are locking themselves in their houses, but they're banging on the doors, on the windows. They don't tire, Crowe. They keep banging until the bones in their arms break. He took a deep drag. "We tried to form squads, shoot them in the head like you said, but God, these are people. Or rather, what's left of them. The constables are going crazy. Some are running. Some are starting to shoot at anything that moves. The authorities have declared a quarantine of the entire East End. No one is entering. No one is leaving. They've abandoned them to their fate. They've cordoned them off with soldiers." Crowe listened silently, leaning back in his chair. Quarantine. It was a sure way to contain panic, but not the plague. It had already broken out. It was in the water. Abercrombie, his voice was hoarse. Water. The Thames. "I know," the inspector nodded grimly. "This morning they caught 3 of them near London Bridge. They crawled ashore, wet and bloated. They attacked the workers." He looked at Crowe and finally noticed his condition. "Damn. Alabaster, are you okay? You're all pale. You're shaking." "Fever," Crowe lied shortly, turning away. "Nothing." But Abercrombie was a detective. His gaze fell on the rolled-up sleeve, on the crimson veins still visible on the wrist. And then he saw the revolver on the table. And he understood everything. There was a heavy pause. "Oh my God," the inspector whispered. "How much?" "I don't know. Hours, maybe. No more than a day." Abercrombie buried his face in his hands. There was despair in his posture. Crowe had been his anchor, his only hope of understanding what was happening. And now he was losing him. "What should we do?" The inspector's voice sounded broken. "We?" Crowe smiled bitterly. "You need to escape the city, Edgar, before it's too late. Take your family and leave. To the countryside, far away." "And you?" "I'm staying, as long as I can. I need to find an antidote, or a way to stop this." He looked at his test tubes. "I have samples. I have my notes. If I can figure out how it works, maybe I can find a vulnerability." "This is madness." "It's the only thing left for me," Crowe shouted. And for the first time, a strange, angry note crept into his voice. He stopped short, grabbed a glass of water from the table, and took a sip. But the water tasted bland, almost disgusting. He wanted something warm, salty. Abercrombie looked at him with horror and pity. "Okay," he said quietly. "What should I do? How can I help?" Crowe, trying to breathe evenly, walked over to the table and scribbled a list on a piece of paper. "I need books. Everything there is on rare tropical diseases, botany, toxicology. From the Royal Society, from the British Museum Library. Everything you can find. And," he hesitated, "I need a test subject. One of them. A living one. Or rather, an active one." "Are you crazy? Bring one of those here?" "To the basement, on a chain. I need to monitor the progression of the disease, test possible antidotes. Without this, I'm working blind." Abercrombie looked at him as if seeing him for the first time. Before him stood not only his friend, but also a scientist, ready to do anything for the truth. And perhaps no longer quite human. I'll see what I can do," the inspector answered evasively. "I'll send you the books." He turned to leave, but paused at the door. "Alabaster, hold on. Hold on to your mind. It's stronger than this crap." After he left, Crowe collapsed into a chair. His initial weakness gave way to a new wave of feverish energy. He grabbed one of the vials of necros and held it up to the lamplight. The black liquid seemed alive, slowly flowing behind the glass. He remembered the captain's words. "The flower of silence. A plant that feeds on death." What if he tried not to kill the parasite, but to put it to sleep? Poison the very flesh it feeds on. Crowe frantically began rummaging through his supplies. Arsenic? Too crude, would kill the host instantly. Potassium cyanide? Same story. He needed something more sophisticated, something that would block neural activity without damaging cells. His gaze fell on the vial of hemlock extract. Neurotoxin, atropine, alkaloids. Yes, this line of thought was correct. Crowe began preparing solutions, mixing poisons with samples of infected blood. His movements were abrupt, imprecise. He broke a flask and the caustic liquid spilled across the table. Cursing himself, he began wiping it away, when suddenly a sharp, stabbing pain shot through his finger. He had cut himself on a shard of glass. A drop of blood, dark scarlet, his blood, fell onto the table. And the smell of blood seemed to him the most delicious aroma in the world. The throbbing in his temples intensified. Hunger awoke in him with a new feral intensity. He looked at his finger, at the oozing blood. And he, Dr. Alabaster Crowe, a man of science, suddenly had a terrible urge to bring his finger to his mouth and lick it off. With a cry of horror and self-loathing, Alabaster Crowe threw the bloody rag aside. He clutched his head, trying to banish the alien thoughts. This isn't me. This is the disease. This isn't me. He walked to the window and opened it, letting in the cold, smoke-filled air. The city was alive with life. Somewhere out there, factories hummed, carriages drove by, people hurried about their business, unaware that the plague was already among them. Or did they already suspect it? The distant sounds of gunfire and screams coming from the east, beyond the cordon, indicated that the peace had come to an end. And then he saw her, Down below, in the narrow alley opposite his house, stood a figure. Tall, thin, wearing a long, dirty cloak. Her face was hidden in shadow, but Crowe felt her gaze on him. A dull, lifeless gaze. The figure didn't move, just stood there and stared at his illuminated window. This was no random passerby. This was a sentry. A hunter who had scented prey. Crowe slammed the window shut and retreated deeper into the room, his heart pounding. They knew. They sensed him as one of their own. Or their future victim. Or both. He looked at the revolver on the table. The promise. It suddenly felt much closer and more real. The fever came back again, and this time it was accompanied by a clear, cold, alien voice in his head that he had never heard before. "Why fight?" the voice whispered. "This is peace. This is the end of the struggle. Join us. We are the future." Crowe closed his eyes. "No," he whispered into the almost tangible darkness of the office. "I'm still alive." But faith in these words melted away with each passing minute, like a candle in a draught. Chapter 6. The sentry at the door and a desperate experiment. The night became an endless waking nightmare for Crowe. Fever tossed him between the sofa and his desk. He would fall into a heavy, dreadful sleep where he would hear whispering voices and visions of shadows devouring each other. Then he would wake up screaming, covered in a cold sweat, with only one awareness. The thing inside him was growing stronger. That cold, alien voice in his head was now almost constant. It wasn't loud, it was a quiet, insistent whisper, just on the edge of perception, like someone else's thoughts intertwining with his own. They are outside. They are waiting. Don't be afraid of them. They are yours. Crowe crawled to the window, hiding behind the frame, and peered through the crack between the curtains. The same tall figure in the dirty cloak was still standing in the alley, motionless, like a statue. But Crowe felt he was watching. An hour ago, a second, stockier man had joined him. They didn't speak, didn't move. They simply stood, their unseeing faces turned toward his house. Sentries. Their very silent presence was more terrifying than any assault. They didn't attack. Why? Were they waiting for the disease to do its work? Did they sense a budding kin within him and see no urgency? Or were they held back by that same flower's will, which saw him, Crowe, as more than just food, but something more? A scientist, a field for experimentation. He crawled back to the center of the room, shaking with weakness and rage. His gaze fell on the revolver. Too loud. The shot would rouse the entire block, attract the attention of the authorities, and then they'd lock him in a cell as a madman, or worse, in a quarantine barracks, where he'd transform and devour half a dozen more unfortunates. No. That path was cut off. His scientific mind, still clinging fiercely to control, analyzed the situation. He was under siege. His resources were limited. Himself. His knowledge. The tools in this office. The enemy was outside the door and within him. The goal was to survive and find an antidote before his mind was consumed by darkness. He approached the reagent table again. The pain in his arm had become dull, a background ache, as if the limb no longer truly belonged to him. The crimson veins had reached his neck. He could feel them under his chin, like a barbed wire collar. The idea of neurotoxins still seemed promising. They needed to paralyze the parasite's nervous system without killing the host instantly. He grabbed a vial of hemlock extract, conine, a pure concentrated nerve poison. His hands shook as he drew a tiny drop into the pipette. "Stop," a voice inside him whispered. "This is pointless. You're ruining the food." Crowe shook his head violently, trying to clear the image. He dropped a drop of the poison into a test tube containing a sample of necrus. At first, nothing happened. Then, the black liquid seemed to boil. The tiny particles in it began to shrink and clump together. The activity he'd observed under the microscope earlier suddenly subsided. The poison was working. It was killing the spores, or at least suppressing them. For a moment, he was filled with wild, almost hysterical hope. But then came bitter disappointment. How could he deliver this poison to an already infected body? Inject it? That could kill the host, too. He needed a host, something that would deliver the poison directly to the nervous system. His gaze fell on another vial, one containing ergot extract, a fungus that parasitizes cereal grains. Ergotamine was extracted from it. In large doses, it was a powerful poison, causing convulsions and gangrene. But in small doses, it was used to treat migraines. It tended to accumulate in nerve tissue. A mad idea formed in his fevered brain. Create a cocktail, conine for instant paralysis, and ergot as a Trojan horse to deliver the poison deeper. But to test it, he needed that very guinea pig he'd asked Abercrombie for. As if in response to his thoughts, a noise came from outside. Not screams, but heavy, dull thuds, the scraping of iron on cobblestone. And voices. Inhuman roars mingled with desperate curses and gunshots. Crowe rushed to the window, forgetting about caution. The street was a living hell. Abercrombie's carriage, all scratched up and with its windows shattered, stood in the middle of the street. The inspector and his 2 men were firing back at a whole crowd of dead people. There were about 10 of them, men, women, even a child with an unnaturally twisted arm. They walked toward the gunfire, fell, and rose again. Abercrombie, standing on the carriage's step, shouted something to his men. One of the constables, wounded in the shoulder, desperately swung his rifle butt. Something fell from the carriage onto the pavement and wound up in a sack. The very same guinea pig. The sentries at the alley finally moved. Hearing the noise of battle and smelling fresh blood, they forgot about Crowe and rushed toward the carriage. This was his chance. Without thinking, Crowe grabbed the syringe he'd prepared, filled with his experimental poison mixture, from the table and rushed down to the hallway. He flung the door open. "Abercrombie, over here!" he shouted, his hoarse voice barely audible over the roar of gunfire. The inspector, seeing him, gave a curt command. The constables, firing back, began to retreat toward the house, dragging behind them the very same bag from which the furious growl was coming. They stumbled into the hallway, out of breath and covered in blood. Abercrombie immediately slammed the door and slid the heavy bolt. "Damn it, Crowe, there's a whole horde of them," he breathed, leaning against the doorframe. "Basement!" Crowe commanded, not looking at him, his gaze fixed on the twitching bag. "Get him to the basement. Quickly!" They dragged the sack down the narrow stairs into the dank, stone room where Crowe kept coal and old medical journals. Another constable, remaining outside, covered their retreat. The last thing they heard before slamming the basement door was his dying scream. By the light of a single kerosene lamp, they untied the sack. A young man, about 20 years old, clad in tattered work clothes, tumbled out. His face was pale, his eyes were filmy, and his mouth was bloodied. He had likely recently bitten someone. His hands and feet were cuffed, but he thrashed wildly, trying to reach the living, his jaws snapping in the air. "Hold him," Crowe ordered, filling a syringe with the deadly mixture. Abercrombie and the remaining constable, their faces heavy and disgusted, pinned the dead man to the floor. The creature howled, writhing with inhuman strength. Crowe dropped to his knees, aiming the syringe at his neck, where the jugular vein ran. His own sore hand shook. "Don't do this," the voice whispered. "He is your brother. Free him." "Shut up," Crowe hissed to himself and thrust the needle hard into the cold flesh. He slowly injected the entire solution. For a moment, nothing happened. The dead man continued to thrash. Then his movements became abrupt, convulsive. His entire body began to convulse. Foam, black and thick, began to pour from his mouth. His growling turned into a hoarse, choking sound. And then, he went silent. Completely. His cloudy eyes glazed over, his body went limp. Completely. Silence reigned in the basement, broken only by the heavy breathing of 3 living people. "Damn," the constable whispered, crawling away from the body. "You killed him. Again." "I stopped him," Crowe corrected, rising. Conflicting emotions raged within him. The triumph of a scientist seeing his hypothesis confirmed, and the horror of a killer using a terrible weapon. And, beneath it all, a quiet, cold disappointment from within. Disappointment that one of his own had been destroyed. "It works," he turned to Abercrombie. "The toxin mixture. It suppresses the parasite's activity. But the dosage, it needs to be calculated precisely. And the delivery method." Suddenly, the basement door swung open. Mrs. Harson stood there, bathed in the light from the hallway. She had returned, despite his orders. Her face was white with horror. She saw the bloodied people, the body on the floor, and Crowe, a syringe in his hand, his face contorted with fever and obsession. "Doctor," she whispered, What have you done?" And her gaze fell on his hand, on that very crimson web now openly crawling along his neck. She screamed and recoiled. At that very moment, a crash came from the hallway outside. Glass shattered. A blow to the front door. Another. They had broken through. The guards had returned with reinforcements. Abercrombie grabbed Crowe by the shoulder. "We need to escape, now, through the back door." Crowe allowed himself to be lifted. His gaze met Mrs. Harson's. Hers was no longer filled with fear, but with horror and disgust. She saw a monster in him. And, looking at her reflection in her eyes, he was beginning to doubt it himself. He was a scientist who had discovered a weapon. But he was also a time bomb. And his clock ticked ever louder, merging with the roar of the dead breaking into his home. Chapter 7. Tapter. Escape from the house of darkness and shelter in the underground. The world narrowed to the sound of hoarse breathing, howling behind her, and the icy horror that gripped her throat. The back door opened onto a tiny, brick-paved courtyard, littered with empty ale barrels. The air, thick with the smell of rot and smoke, was a sweet nectar after the stifling atmosphere of the house. "Run! To the embankment!" Abercrombie commanded, pushing the terrified Mrs. Harson forward. The remaining constable, pale as death, ran after them, turning and aiming his revolver at the dark doorway, from which heavy footsteps were already coming. Crowe ran, barely feeling his legs. His body was a strange, unruly machine. The fever had receded, replaced by a strange, unnatural clarity and a surge of strength. He knew this wasn't recovery, but the death throes of his humanity. "Run," something inside him whispered. "Run to your people, to us." He glanced back. Two of the men standing in the alley tumbled out of the back door. Their bleary eyes found him in the gloom, and ignoring the constable, they rushed after him. Their target was obvious. Rushing out onto the embankment, they saw that hell had already arrived. Several houses were ablaze in the distance, illuminating the swirling fog with an ominous glow. Silhouettes darted through the streets, some running in panic, others pursuing them with a characteristic shuffling gait. Shots, screams, and that familiar roar could be heard. "Into the carriage!" Abercrombie pointed to his carriage, still parked at the curb, but now mangled, with the dead horse in harness. One of the men they'd shot sat on the step, chewing something dark. He looked up at their appearance. The inspector, without aiming, shot him in the face. The creature fell to the pavement. "The carriage won't go," the constable shouted. "Then down, into the tunnels." Crowe pointed to a massive arched entrance 100 yards away. It was one of the service entrances to the subway line under construction, the Metropolitan Railway. A deep, dark maw leading underground. It was madness, but on the surface, it was certain death. They rushed toward the tunnel, tripping over scattered belongings and bodies. Mrs. Harson, crying, tried to keep up. Crowe walked last, feeling the pursuit gaining on him. The scent of his sweat, his fear, his illness was a beacon for them. The survivors burst into the tunnel. The darkness was almost total, only a dim light streaming from the entrance behind them, revealing rails and piles of construction materials. The air was stale, smelling of damp and coal dust. "Where to now?" the constable asked breathlessly. "Deeper," Abercrombie said curtly, lighting his police flashlight. "We're looking for a fork in the road, a utility room, anything." They moved forward, disappearing into the darkness. Their footsteps echoed in the stone dungeon. Crowe walked, barely able to see the road, his consciousness floating. Images floated and faded. Alice's face, the burning sea ghost, the convulsing body of a young worker. And everywhere, that sweet smell of rotting honey. It was everywhere, even here, underground. They're everywhere. There's no escape. Surrender. Suddenly, a rustling sound came from the darkness ahead. Everyone froze. Abercrombie aimed the beam of his flashlight. In a niche between the brick walls sat a family. A man, a woman, and a girl of about 7. They huddled close together, their faces contorted with fear. "Don't shoot!" the man shouted, shielding his wife and child. "We're alive. We escaped from those creatures." A wave of relief, weak and fragile, washed over the fugitives. "What's your name?" Abercrombie asked cautiously, lowering his revolver. Henry Wallace. This is my wife, Martha, and my daughter, Sarah. We're from Whitechapel. There's nothing left there." They joined the group. 7 against the darkness. A fragile truce reigned briefly. They continued on until they came across a locked metal door with a sign reading Depot Number 7. Abercrombie shot the lockdown with a few shots. Inside was a small room, apparently a former tool storage room. It was relatively clean and, most importantly, it was possible to barricade itself. They slid heavy steel beams behind the door. In the silence, broken only by the girl's heavy breathing and sobs, they could finally catch their breath. Abercrombie surveyed the room. The constable sat down on a box, trying to reload his revolver with shaking hands. Mrs. Harson, still not looking at Crowe, consoled little Sarah. Henry Wallace approached Crowe. "Sir, are you a doctor? Are you hurt?" He pointed at Crowe's arm, which he was unsuccessfully trying to pull up his sleeve. Crowe jerked his hand away. "It's nothing. It's an old wound." But Wallace looked more closely. His eyes widened. He recoiled. "No," he whispered. "No, you're one of them. You're infected." Everyone froze. The tension in the tiny room reached boiling point. "What?" Abercrombie turned sharply, his gaze darting between Crowe and Wallace. "I've seen his kind," Wallace shouted, pointing a finger at Crowe. "First the arm, then the neck, then the eyes go blurry. He's going to transform. He's going to kill us all in our sleep." Mrs. Harson screamed and dragged the girl to the far corner. The constable stood up, raising his weapon hesitantly. "Calm down." Abercrombie tried to take control of the situation. "Dr. Crowe is looking for a cure. He's on our side." "Before he turns into one," Wallace persisted. "Throw him out, or shoot him, before it's too late." Crowe stood with his head bowed. He felt their fear. He shared it. He looked at his hands, the long, thin fingers of a surgeon, which would soon perhaps tear flesh. "He's right," Crowe said quietly. All eyes turned to him. "I have no more than a day, maybe less. I'm becoming dangerous." "Alabaster," Abercrombie began. "No, Edgar." Crowe looked up at him, and there was determination mixed with madness in his eyes. "Tie me up, while I'm still myself, with a chain, a rope, whatever, in that alcove over there. If I change, you know what to do." Abercrombie looked at him, a struggle playing out on his face. Duty, friendship, fear. "I won't allow it," Wallace shouted. He could already be contagious. "Silence," Abercrombie barked, his voice hardening with a steely edge that brooked no argument. "He's staying, but we'll take action." They found a piece of strong chain and a steel collar, apparently for a service dog. With disgust and bone-chilling fear, Abercrombie secured the collar around Crowe's neck and chained him to a massive pipe in the corner of the room. The click of the lock sounded like a death sentence. Crowe retreated into his niche, feeling the cold metal on his skin. He felt like a rabid dog on a chain, humiliating, scary, but necessary. "Are you happy now?" Abercrombie asked Wallace gloomily. He muttered something and walked away, not taking his suspicious gaze off Crowe. The night in the underground shelter dragged on painfully long. They extinguished Abercrombie's lantern to conserve kerosene. Absolute, oppressive darkness reigned. The only sounds were Sarah's ragged breathing, her cries, and a distant grinding sound from the depths of the tunnels, whether it was a train or something else. Crowe sat on the cold stone floor, his back pressed against the wall. The chain allowed him some movement, but prevented him from leaving. He closed his eyes, trying to concentrate, to push away the obsession. He mentally repeated formulas, the names of skeletal bones, Latin terms, anything that could remind him of who he was. But the voice was stronger. "They fear you. They hate you. They are food. We are strength. Break the chains. Kill them. Start with the one who screamed. Eat him first." Wallace's image, his terrified face, appeared before him. Crowe felt a wave of something hot and sour hit his salivary glands. Not hunger, thirst. Thirst for that warm, salty moisture that pulsed through his veins. He scooped up a handful of dust from the floor and began scribbling the chemical formulas of his poison on the wall with trembling fingers. Coneine, C8H17N, ergotamine, C33H35N505. This was his mantra, his shield. As long as he remembered it, he was Dr. Alabaster Crowe. Suddenly, a sound was heard from outside the door. Not a grinding or a roar, but a quiet, melodic, childish chant. "London Bridge is falling down, falling down, falling down." A chill ran down Crowe's spine. In the darkness, he heard little Sarah stir. "Mom?" she called softly. "There's a girl singing." "Be quiet, dear," her mother whispered fearfully. The chant continued, getting closer. "My fair lady." He was right outside the door. And then another sound was heard. A quiet, persistent scraping sound. Someone was scratching at the door from the outside. Carefully, almost gently. Everyone in the room froze, holding their breath. Even Crowe's inner voice fell silent for a moment, listening. Then the scraping grew louder, and others joined in, and more. Scratching, scraping, shuffling sounds. There were many of them. Dozens. They found them. Without breaking down the door, without smashing it. They simply surrounded them. Enveloped them with their presence. Waited. Abercrombie slowly and silently raised his revolver. his silhouette in the darkness, tense to the limit. Crowe sat in his alcove, chained, staring into the black, unseeing space before him. He felt them, not as a threat, but as kin. A crowd waiting for their preacher to come out. And the worst thing was that he liked part of it. Chapter 8. Chain and Cocktail. The silence in the depot's small room was deafening, absolute. Only a faint hissing, like the rustling of dry leaves, could be heard through the thick metal door. They weren't banging or thrashing. They were waiting. And that made it 1,000 times more terrifying. Little Sarah buried her face in her mother's dress, stifling her sobs. Mrs. Harson monotonously whispered a prayer. Henry Wallace and the constable sat with their backs against the wall, their eyes glued to the locked door. Abercrombie stood at his post, revolver in hand, his tired face a stony mask, and only Crowe, chained in his corner, was calm. Or rather not calm, but immersed in a strange, feverish concentration. The inner voice fell silent. Now his mind was filled with one thing: chemical formulas. He traced them on the dusty floor with a broken brick. Coneine, ergotamine. But that's not enough. We need a catalyst. Something that will enhance penetration across the blood-brain barrier. He raised his head and looked at Abercrombie. His voice was hoarse but clear, like the old days in anatomy. Edgar, in my bag, zipped pocket. There's an ampule with the inscription, Chilibuca. Abercrombie turned slowly, his gaze full of disbelief. For what? This is strychnine, a powerful neurotoxin. Crowe pointed to his blueprints. My cocktail. It suppresses activity but doesn't destroy the spores completely. We need more, stronger. Strychnine combined with coneine. It will burn the nervous system to the ground. You want to use this on one of them? Abercrombie nodded toward the door. No, Crowe answered quietly. To my place. A deathly silence fell over the room. Everyone looked at him. You're crazy, Wallace whispered. Perhaps, Crowe agreed. But it's the only chance. The infection is already deep within me. There's a 90% chance I can't be saved. But we need to find out if it's even possible to kill this infection inside a living organism. If my theory is correct, the cocktail will cause total spasm and respiratory arrest before the parasite has a chance to completely rewire my nervous system. I'll die a human being, and you'll gain valuable data. No, Abercrombie said firmly. I won't let you commit suicide. This isn't suicide, Edgar. Crowe's voice rose to a scream, and that same alien note crept into it again. This is an experiment. The last, the most important. You must understand. If this works, you will have a weapon. You will be able to do more than just shoot. You will be able to decontaminate. You must... He grabbed the chain, his knuckles white. You must do this while I can still give informed consent. While I am still me. He looked at Abercrombie, and in his eyes burned the fire of last hope, mixed with the hellish flames of illness. Abercrombie looked at him, a struggle raging within him. He saw a scientist willing to do anything for the truth. He saw a friend doomed to a painful death no matter what. And, He saw a monster he might unleash. "Give me the ampule, Edgar," Crowe said quietly, almost in a whisper. "I'll do it myself." The inspector slowly, as if against his will, approached the bag. He found an ampule, a small glass tube containing a clear liquid. Death. He extended it to Crowe, just beyond the chain's length, their fingers almost touching. Crowe took the ampule. His hands barely trembled. He was calm. He prepared a syringe and mixed the remainder of his poisonous cocktail with pure, undiluted strychnine. The result was a cloudy, yellowish liquid. "Write everything down, Edgar," he said, holding the syringe up to the light. "Time of administration, first symptoms, nature of the convulsions, everything." Abercrombie nodded silently, clenching his fists. He took out his notebook. Crowe looked at the other occupants of the room. Mrs. Harson looked at him with horror and disgust. Wallace turned away. The girl was crying. "Fools!" a suddenly muffled voice whispered in my head. "They don't understand the grandeur of this moment." Crowe took a deep breath. He plunged the needle into the jugular vein in his neck. A chill spread through his body. He slowly pressed the plunger. At first, nothing. A stream of clarity. He felt every beat of his heart, seen every crack in the ceiling, heard every ragged breath in the room. Then, the pain came. Inhuman, tearing, as if all his nerves had been simultaneously brought to a fire. His body convulsed, and he slammed his head against the wall. The chain rattled. A hoarse, inhuman sound erupted from his throat. "Convulsions!" he shouted through clenched teeth, trying to be a scientist to the end. "Tonic-clonic. Write it down." Abercrombie, pale as a sheet, scribbled something in his notebook, his hands shaking. The pain intensified. Crowe arched, his bones cracking. He saw stars, darkness, flashes of light. He felt his lungs refusing to breathe. It was agony. But it was human agony. And then, something clicked. The pain suddenly subsided. Not because the poison had worn off, but because his nervous system had rewired itself. The very barrier he'd been trying to attack had fallen. Not from the poison, but from the plague. The poison, lethal to humans, became merely fuel for a new metabolism. Strychnine and conine, instead of killing the parasite, entered into a monstrous symbiosis with Necrus, amplifying it tenfold. The convulsion stopped. Crowe slowly straightened up. He sat with his back against the wall. His breathing evened out, became deep and slow. He raised his head, and he opened his eyes. There was almost no whiteness left in them. They were black, pitch black, bottomless. Like that flower. There was no pain, no fear, no hope in them. Only cold, indifferent omniscience. He looked at Abercrombie. "The experiment is complete," he said. His voice was the same, but the intonation was alien. mechanical, devoid of any emotion. He stood up. The chain holding him tensed and snapped with a loud crash just below the collar, as if it were made of clay. The metal couldn't withstand the new, inhuman force raging within him. He was free. Abercrombie froze. His revolver pointed at his former friend. "Alabaster," he whispered. "Dr. Crowe is dead." The one who was now simply stated, "I am the next step. The fruit of knowledge, and I am hungry." His gaze slid over the frightened people in the room and stopped on Wallace. Chapter 9. The Fruit of Knowledge. Wallace was the first to move. With a cry of pure animal terror, he rushed to the door, desperately tugging at the beam that barricaded it. "Open up! For God's sake, open up!" But it was already too late. It wasn't even an attack. It was a phenomenon. One moment, Crowe stood in his corner. The next, he was at Wallace's side, not running, but rather dissolving in one place and materializing in another. His hand, the same one that had once held a scalpel with surgical precision, lashed out. His fingers, long and pale, sank into Wallace's throat with bone-crushing force, and with a sickening crunch tore him out, along with part of his spine. Wallace's scream died away, turning into a gurgling wheeze. Blood gushed like a fountain onto the wall and onto Crowe's motionless face. He didn't even blink. Wallace's wife screamed. The constable, paralyzed with fear, finally fired. The bullet struck Crowe in the shoulder. He staggered slightly, turned his head, and looked at the constable with his bottomless black eyes. It wasn't blood that oozed from the wound, but that same thick, black liquid. He dropped Wallace's body and stepped toward the constable. The constable fired again, hitting him in the chest. No effect. Crowe grabbed his head and twisted it 180 degrees. The crunch of bones was deafeningly loud in the small room. Abercrombie fired. Once. Twice. 3 times. In the chest. In the stomach. He saw the bullets pierce flesh, but saw no reaction. He aimed for the head, but Crowe moved with an unnatural, frightening speed. "Alabaster, wake up!" he screamed in a last, desperate hope. The one who had been Crowe stopped in front of him. He looked at the inspector without hatred, without anger. He watched as a scientist would look at an interesting specimen. "Abercrombie," he said, and there was a hint of familiarity in his voice, as if he were trying to remember. The data. Did you write down the data?" "Yes, damn it, I wrote it down," Abercrombie cried, sobbing, lowering the revolver. He knew this was the end. "Good," Crowe nodded with a strange semblance of satisfaction. "Science demands sacrifice." His hand darted forward, quickly, precisely, without the slightest effort. His fingers pierced Abercrombie's chest, pierced his ribs, and squeezed his still-beating heart. The pain was excruciating, but brief. Inspector Edgar Abercrombie saw the black, bottomless eyes of his former friend before him. He saw the reflections of the flames dancing in their depths. And then everything blurred, darkened, and his last thought was a bitter irony. He had been keeping notes until the very end. Crowe pulled his hand back, holding a warm, pulsing lump of muscle in his fingers. He brought it to his nose, inhaled the scent, and then took a bite. Without expression, without emotion, simply because it was necessary. He turned to the rest of the group, Mrs. Harson clutching a crying Sarah and her mother standing before them like a human shield. He took a step. Suddenly a deafening explosion erupted outside. The door blew open, revealing the silhouettes of soldiers in red uniforms shrouded in smoke. Royal Engineers. Behind them, flamethrowers. "Clear the tunnel, with fire," came the command. Crowe stood motionless, staring at the flames. His black eyes reflected the dancing flames. There was no fear in them, only interest. A new factor, a new variable in the equation. He turned and, ignoring the soldiers and the women's cries, stepped deeper into the tunnel, into the impenetrable darkness. His silhouette dissolved into the gloom, taking with it knowledge, despair, and death. On the depot floor, among the scattered bodies, lay Abercrombie's blood-stained notebook. On the last page, stained with blood, only a few words were legible. The experiment failed. Crowe has become unstoppable. God, forgive us all. Outside, in the streets of London, buildings burned. Gunshots and roars could be heard. The plague wasn't over. It had only just begun its march. And its prophet and first perfect soldier was the one who once tried to stop it. Dr. Alabaster Crowe had found his immortality, and it was more terrible than any death.